Good morning, everyone. It's wonderful to be with you today. So we've hit a milestone in our family where we now have 2 adult children. I know, how did that happen? And as you do with milestones, we started reminiscing about going into hospital and giving birth to our wonderful boy, and just then all the milestones that follow, from learning to talk and walk to going to primary school, finishing primary school, going into secondary school, finishing secondary school, and then eventually saying goodbye and leaving home. And we all have these defining moments, don't we, that shape the timeline of our lives. And the same could be said with our journey with Jesus. Whether you've been a Christian for maybe just a really short while, or you've known Jesus the whole of your life, your story of following Jesus will be punctuated with these defining moments. And actually, if we stop to think about it for a moment, a lot of these defining moments are actually nearly always not of our choosing. Painful, heartbreaking, isolating moments that can often bring about uncertainty and fear and desolation. That turn of the corner when you're really hoping that you're going to see some light and things are going to start to get better, doesn't come. And you're hoping to see light breaking in and breaking through at some point really soon. And it feels like, when? Perhaps it's a failed venture or a betrayal of a close friend. Maybe a prolonged illness that has now developed complications, or maybe it's financial worries and you're at your wit's end, and then out of nowhere an unexpected bill comes in and you just don't know what to do. These are times when things go from shades of grey to sheets of black. Eugene Peterson once wrote, "The language of prayer is forged in the crucible of trouble. When we can't help ourselves and call for help. When we don't like where we're at and we want out. When we don't like who we are and we want to change. We use primal language, and this language becomes the root language of prayer." In the midst of these life-shaping, sometimes life-altering events and seasons in our lives, the crucible of trouble can cause us to walk away from Jesus. It can cause us to turn and run, to give up on him, to harden our hearts towards him. Or it can, if we let it, propel us further towards Jesus, further into his presence, into his guidance, into his peace, into his strength, into his love, as we put our trust in his character, his faithfulness, his steadfastness, his kingship. We're in a series right now in the Psalms, and today we are going to be looking at Psalm 34. But in order for us to understand this psalm, we need to go back. So let me recap for a moment. So David, he's defeated Goliath. Now, whether you've been in church a long time or this is your first Sunday in, I think probably you will know the story of David and Goliath. And so Saul, who is king, he takes a liking to David and he places David over his vast army of men. And David leads this whole vast army into numerous victorious battles. And so one day David is entering the city after, again, another wonderful battle that he has won. And the women, they come out of their homes and they are singing and they are dancing with great joy. And there is one line in this song that is like the beginning of the end for David. And they sang this: "Saul has slain his thousands and David his 10,000s. That is the nail in the coffin for David. And from that moment, Saul eyed David with increasing jealousy. And it ruined David's life. And so for the next few years, David's life could be summed up as a series called Run for Your Life. As Saul is trying to kill David, and David is constantly looking over his shoulder. He is on the run from Saul, and Saul is always in hot pursuit. And so David, on the run, he goes to the king of Gath, Achish, I think he's called. And he seeks refuge there because he literally has nowhere else to go, nowhere else to hide. And suddenly he realizes, oh my goodness, this is a terrible mistake because this is where Goliath came from. And I killed their best warrior. So immediately he's like, what on earth can I do? I need to get out of this mess. And so he feigns madness and he changes his behavior and he starts scratching on the doors of the gate and he's allowing saliva to drip all the way down his beard. And Achish, this king, he says to his servants in 1 Samuel chapter 21, he says this, look at the man. He's insane. Why bring him to me? Am I so short of madmen that you have to bring this fellow here to carry on like this in front of me? Must this man come into my house? So David escaped and he went to the cave of Adullam, and that is where he wrote Psalm 34. And this psalm is a testimony of all that David has endured. So he's hiding in this cave, he's physically worn out, emotionally he is absolutely drained, he's spent. Mentally, he's about to lose it all. He's high on anxiety and worry and fear for his life. Everything has gone from bad to worse for David. Trouble, adversity, heartache, it's all surrounding him. So why, despite all of this crucible of trouble, why is it propelling David towards God and not away from him? Why don't we read together? We're in Psalm 34 and we're going to read verses 1 to 10. This is what David says. I will extol the Lord at all times. His praise will always be on my lips. I will glory in the Lord. Let the afflicted hear and rejoice. Glorify the Lord with me. Let us exalt his name together. I sought the Lord and he answered me. He delivered me from all my fears. Those who look to him are radiant. Their faces are never covered with shame. This poor man called and the Lord heard him. He saved him out of all his troubles. The angel of the Lord encamps around those who fear him and he delivers them. Taste and see that the Lord is good. Blessed is the one who takes refuge in him. Fear the Lord, you his holy people, for those who fear him lack nothing. The lions may grow weak and hungry, but those who seek the Lord lack no good thing. Amen. So, we're asking the question today, when trouble hits, what do I do? What do I do? So picture the scene. There's David, he's hiding in this cave, he's got enemies all around him in every direction, and there is no guarantee of his outcome. In fact, there is no guarantee even when he's going to get his next meal. This is one of the lowest points in David's life because everything has literally fallen apart. And yet, the first thing that David does is he praises God. Now, we can't accuse David of being unrealistic, can we? Because he knows only too well the situation that he's in. Of all the things that he could say, of all the things that he could do, he chose to praise God. Praise was his weapon of choice. Praise was how he was going to fight his battle. When trouble times hit, what do? I choose to praise. Praise is my weapon of choice. And this whole psalm, you can see it is a song of praise. You can see the thread that runs all the way through it. In fact, this is what David did. every time trouble hit, he fought back, and he fought back with praise. If you like, it was his number one go-to. Psalm 30, verse 1, I will exalt you, Lord, for you lifted me out of the depths and did not let my enemies gloat over me. Psalm 66, verse 17, I cried out to him with my mouth. His praise was on my tongue. Psalm 145, verse 1, I will exalt you, my God the King. I'll praise your name forever and ever. Psalm 69, verse 30, I will praise God's name in song and glorify him with thanksgiving. Psalm 118, verse 28, you are my God and I will praise you. You are my God and I will exalt you. And then our passage today, Psalm 34, verses 1 to 3, I will extol the Lord at all times. His praise will always be on my lips. I will glory in the Lord. Let the afflicted hear and rejoice. Glorify the Lord with me. Let us exalt his name together. I have a lot to learn. When trouble hits me, my go-tos are comfort eating or anger or apathy, you know, where you just want to hide under the duvet and never, ever come out. Or I want to run. I want to run as far away as I possibly can and never come back. Or sometimes it's, I need to fix it. Just tell me what needs to be done and let me fix it. Praise is not my natural inclination, because I'm too busy trying to remove all the feelings and all the emotions that come at me when troubled times hit me. Perhaps I'm not the only one. What is your weapon of choice? What's your go-to? Perhaps it's self-medicating. Maybe it's denial or running. Perhaps it's control. Maybe it's turning our back on God. Maybe it's blaming others or blaming yourself. The difference between me and perhaps you and David is, above all things, all trouble, all feelings, all emotions, when trouble hits, the very first thing that comes out of David's mouth is thankful praise. David has this amazing ability to store up and to seal in and to make front and center his testimony. His recall of what God has done in his life, the abundant grace and mercy that he has experienced, is the cornerstone that he has built his entire life on. And it is the lens through which he deals with this horrendous situation, this pain, this grief, this loss. In verses 4 to 10, David tells us why he's so intent on always giving God the praise. He says, I sought the Lord and he answered me. He delivered me from all my fears. Those who look to him are radiant. Their faces are never covered with shame. This poor man called and the Lord heard him. He saved him out of all his troubles. Sincere praise has the power to move us beyond our own emotions and feelings because it's centered on the Lord. It causes us to look up and fix our eyes on him, on who he is and what he's done and how he's saved us and how he's protected us and how he's pulled us through over and over again. Praise is a product of remembering what God has done in our lives. And we can see the power of what that does, how it moves us beyond just our own emotions and feelings. It moves us beyond that to what God has done, to who he is and how he will bring us through. David could say what he says in verses 1 to 3 because of what God has done for him in verses 4 to 10. And it seems to me that if we want praise to be the weapon in which we fight when troubled times hit us, then we need to learn how to cultivate it, probably at the very moment that we least want to do that. And that is in the night time of our lives. This is where true praise is birthed and nurtured and cultivated. Because praise without suffering is shallow. Praise without experiences that have tried and tested our faith are fleeting. Nelson Mandela, he was raised and grew up in apartheid in South Africa. and he gave his work to dismantling apartheid. He was imprisoned for his revolutionary work with the ANC, and he was sentenced to life in prison. And he served 27 years in jail. Yet he did not allow the hate of apartheid or 27 years separated from his wife and his children and his fellow countrymen to embitter him. They took away his name and they gave him a number, prisoner 46664. They put him in solitary confinement that was known to break any person's will and mind. But through it all, Nelson Mandela did not allow what he faced to turn him away from his God or his faith in God. He became the first black head of state and president of South Africa. Friends, praise is not something that we just do with our mouths, but it's also how we choose to live our lives in the face of trouble and negative circumstances. David turned his cave into a cathedral of praise, and when he reached rock bottom, he found God is the rock at the bottom. When times of trouble come my way, what do? I choose to praise. Praise will be my weapon of choice. Secondly, when trouble times hit, what do? I lean into fellowship. Fellowship is my non-negotiable. So as David fled to this cave, we see something really interesting happen. And in 1 Samuel 22, verses 1 to 2, it says this: David left Gath and escaped to the cave of Adullam. When his brothers and his father's household heard about it, they went down to him there. All those who were in distress or in debt or discontented gathered round him, and he became their commander. About 400 men were with him. David had nowhere else to go. He couldn't return to the palace. He couldn't return to Samuel or Jonathan or to the house of the Lord. He just went to the cave. And it was there in that place of isolation that God provided fellowship for David. Now, it wasn't necessarily the people that David may have picked to hang out with. Yet they were people who identified something in David that they recognized in themselves, and God called them to gather around David and to support him. Often when trouble hits, we can so easily, I think, find ourselves in caves of isolation, separating ourselves apart from everyone else, because sometimes, let's be honest, it's super tempting, isn't it? We think, do you know what? Life is just easier if I'm just by myself, struggling away, than having to deal with anyone else as well. And if I'm honest with you, I have found myself recently in this situation. Isolation is definitely one of my coping strategies. I just think, well, it's easier by myself. Yet I know that's not God's best for me. I know that's not how he wanted me to live or intends for me to live. It's not good for me, and it's not healthy for me. The Greek word for fellowship is koinonia, and koinonia means holding our lives in common. Jesus' intention for his church is to reflect this. Yet it's pretty hard to do if we're all living our lives in caves of isolation. You see, I become more shaped, more rounded, more molded and whole when I spend time in fellowship and I lean into that and not away from it. When I choose to share my troubles, where I choose to be vulnerable with others, when I'm on the receiving end on other people's prayers and support and encouragement. A few years ago now, Chuck and I, we were in London at a leaders gathering, and Nicky Gumbel was he was doing an interview with an influential Christian leader. And he was asking him about his journey through his wife being diagnosed with cancer and then nursing her through cancer and then her subsequent death. And it was a really, really moving story. And Nicky Gumbel, he asked the question, he said, what did Jesus show you through this really testing time? And this leader said, I learned it's really difficult to build a storm shelter when the storm has already come. You have to build a storm shelter before the storm comes. David was never meant to go through trouble alone. We are never meant to go through trouble alone. When times of trouble come my way, what do? I choose to lean into fellowship. Fellowship will be my non-negotiable. Thirdly, when trouble hits, what do? I choose to depend upon God. Dependence is my choice. One thing I think we need to take away from this psalm is that if we didn't know it already, God has not promised us a trouble-free life. Verse 19, David says, "The righteous person may have many troubles, but the Lord delivers them from them all." Now, you may meet some people who say, well, I became a Christian and now all my troubles are over and it's like I'm walking around on cloud nine, and you're like, I don't think it works like that, mate. One theologian, he wrote this in his commentary: deliverance is one thing, exemption from trouble is another. David, in the midst of his troubles, he trusted God. He depended on him beyond what he felt and what he could see. He depended on him when he didn't know what the outcome was going to be. He depended on him when he didn't even know what his next step was going to be. It's like we can almost feel David's resolve emanate through this psalm. You know, can you feel it? It's like tangible, isn't it? This deep, satisfying resolve to place his dependence away from himself and fully onto God. You see, it takes work. It takes work to hold on to Jesus when everything else is falling apart. It takes work to hold on to Jesus rather than rely on ourselves. It takes work to trust in him no matter what. Yet when we surrender our insistence that God does things our way, and instead we put our dependence fully on God, in his goodness, in his authority, in his power, in his majesty, in his kinship, in his mercy, we discover, just like David, that we are brought into a place where no amount of pain or rejection or tragedy can touch or destroy our dependence in the Lord. In times of trouble, David stood in total dependence on the Lord. When times of trouble come my way, what do? I choose to depend on God. Dependence will be my choice. Let me finish with this. Notice right after this in verse 20. It says, he protects all his bones. Not one of them will be broken. Where have we heard that before? John 19, verse 31 to 33. It says this: now it was a day of preparation, and the next day was to be a special Sabbath, because the Jewish leaders did not want the bodies left on the crosses during the Sabbath. They asked Pilate to have the legs broken and the bodies taken down. The soldiers therefore came and broke the legs of the first man who'd been crucified with Jesus, and then those of the other. But when they came to Jesus and found that he was already dead, they did not break his legs. And we see here John referring to this psalm when he was writing about Jesus' crucifixion. The biggest and the greatest trouble that we will ever face is the affliction of death because of our own sin. But God, he provided a redeemer. He provided Jesus. Verse 22, but the Lord will redeem those who serve him. No one who takes refuge in him will be condemned. Jesus, he paid our ransom. He purchased our freedom. Sin enslaved us, but Jesus died on the cross to redeem you and me. He bore our griefs, our sorrow, our shame, our pain there on that absolutely hideous cross. When trouble hits, I think the hope that this psalm brings to us is that we can have a confidence that whatever happens, whatever trouble comes our way, on our last day, wherever that might be, whenever that might be, we have utter assurance and confidence that we will be delivered out of every kind of trouble that we will face and have faced. And we will never, ever need to face any kind of trouble ever again. Why? Because Jesus, he has already faced the worst kind of trouble imaginable. He suffered in our place, he took on death, and he defeated it, allowing us to walk out of the troubles of this life and into the freedom of life everlasting with Jesus. Why don't we stand?